Afrocentricity is the idea that we're viewing the phenomenon from an African-centered perspective, studying the world from that perspective. I think the most important aspect of it is that the people can see it and people can be influenced by the ideas that are on the program. That it takes ideas beyond the campus and it makes people aware of ideas that they never have thought of before. Hello and welcome to Afrocentricity. I'm your host, Michael Washington. The topic of today's panel discussion is racism, militarism, and the deaths of unarmed Africans. Before I introduce our moderator, allow me to say a few introductory remarks that will establish a historical context for our discussion. I will title my remarks, Racism, Militarism, and the Deaths of Unarmed Africans. When we think of the word militarism, we often confuse it with military service. While every nation has the right to defend the integrity of its borders by means of military service, militarism exists when a nation's core values produce an exaltation of military virtues and ideas. This invariably means indoctrinating people with the belief that it is virtuous to commit genocide against humanity. By exalting the aggression and slaughter of innocent populations, this type of indoctrination goes far beyond the service of defending a nation's borders. Classic examples of this are fascist Italy under Mussolini and Italy's mass murder of the people in Ethiopia, imperialist Japan and the genocidal treatment of the Chinese in places like Manchuria, Shanghai, and Nanking. And of course, we can't forget Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews and other populations of human beings. From these examples, we may define militarism as the martial enforcement of genocidal policies and practices with the greatest numbers affecting populations of non-European people. But militarism is more than this. It is the internalization of militaristic virtues and ideas. By martial enforcement, we mean enforced by the military. Fear of the military compels people to conform to militaristic virtues. Nonconformists risk massive retaliation from the government. Not many people are willing to risk this. However, in rare instances, nonconformists are positioned politically to create a revolution and drive the militarist out. An example of this is the process by which the 13 British colonies became the United States. As long as England's colonial subjects conformed to policies of subordination, there was no problem. But the international slave trade and the enslavement of Africans in the colonies generated enough wealth for the colonial subjects to establish their own economies independent of Great Britain. When this happened, the colonial leaders declared war on their mother country in pursuit of their own economic interest and national identity. When the British retaliated by militarizing its empire to capture or kill those who deviated from colonial policy, the Revolutionary War was on. And we know the rest of the story. In this case, the founding fathers of the United States did not permit themselves to internalize the militaristic policies of their colonizer. They fought a war to prevent this. After winning the war, they replaced their old British identities with the new racial classification of white. Unfortunately, for the Native and African Americans, the Founding Fathers' victory positioned the United States to expand its land base and its slave-driven economy. This was achieved by the martial enforcement of genocidal policies and practices against the people whose land it was and the people who would be coerced into enslavement. Since the white founders disqualified both groups from citizenship, the military was deployed to confiscate natives' land while the police enforced law and order to ensure the preservation of slavery. Law enforcement officials were required to arrest persons suspected of being runaways or fugitives. This was a clever way to kidnap and thrust unknown numbers of free blacks into slavery. In order to prevent competition from other white nations, the Founding Fathers declared the United States the sole colonizer of the entire Western Hemisphere and warned against European interference. In what came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the United States proclaimed that it would stay out of European affairs, that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization, and that the United States would respond to any European actions in the Americas. With the intent of spreading the enslavement of Africans into provinces controlled by Spain, the United States allowed Southern slaveholders to invade and settle Texas with full knowledge of the fact that gringos, the Mexican word for white folks, were welcomed, but slavery was not. The Mexican army attempted to drive the slaveholders out of Texas and defeated 187 frontiersmen at the Catholic mission called the Alamo. Those who died at the Alamo became martyrs for the cause of white supremacy, and the Alamo became a sacred space, a consecrated shrine. The very thought of hordes of Mexicans crossing the border in defense of their interests was considered so reprehensible that it should never be forgotten. So that, "Remember the Alamo," became the rallying cry and a call for vengeance. More than that, it became coded language to impose militaristic policies against people who threatened the southern borders. When Sam Houston's forces defeated the Mexican army after the white supremacists had lost their Catholic mission outpost, his battle cry was, "Remember the Alamo." The militarists, under the leadership of Sam Houston, went on to defeat the Mexican army, then took Texas from Mexico so that whites who had the liberty to own black people as slaves would have a new state, that they would unbalance the fragile union to favor the South. About a decade after the South took Texas, the United States declared war on Mexico in 1846. The battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," whipped whites into such a frenzy that by the time they became sobered by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States had acquired 55% of Mexico's pre-war territory. This meant that all or part of 10 states were brought into the Union. And these states include California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Texas, and parts of Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and Oklahoma. We are still remembering the Alamo when we see the extreme militarization of the southern border communities from California to Texas. Couched in the language of war, the policies enforced by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection deploy military-style enforcement tactics, equipment, and strategies to control the border zone. Whether it's a war on drugs, a war on crime, or a war on terror, the use of drone planes, military helicopters, and the coordination of local law enforcement function to create repressive conditions that contribute to mass detentions and deportations and the criminalization of entire communities. The image of black Haitians being whipped at the southern borders by patrol agents on horseback is reminiscent of the nightmarish event in the spring of 1965 known as Bloody Sunday, when horseback riding Alabama law enforcement officials stampeded nonviolent, unarmed civil rights marchers who were attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Because Haitian immigrants who were successful in becoming U.S. citizens are black people, they may often find themselves in greater danger from law enforcement than the immigrants on the border. In 1997, a Haitian immigrant named Abder Loimo found this out when he was sodomized with a wooden plunger handle in a Brooklyn precinct by several officers of the law. Research conducted by Daniel Buford in what he calls Close Encounters of a Dangerous Kind reveals that torture by the police is a commonly shared experience of unarmed African-American men and women and children. Buford found numerous other torture methods used by law enforcement. Between 1970 and 2015 alone, he found cases that were examples of unconstitutional search and seizures, deaths in custody, torture by taser/electroshock, chest compression, asphyxia, beating, choking, starvation, genital torture, scalding, multiple gunshots, execution-style shootings, use of chemical agents, beatings while handcuffed, and denial of medical treatment. Since its slave patrol origins as the enforcer of slave codes, law enforcement has come a long way toward becoming indistinguishable from the military. Some people believe that this is because the militarization of local police is necessary in order to contain and control the black population, who are forced by poverty to live in occupation zones or internal colonies that we commonly refer to as ghettos. This means that on a daily basis, entire communities of black people and other people of color come under assault by law enforcement officers with armored personnel carriers, assault rifles, submachine guns, flashbang grenades, grenade launchers, sniper rifles, and special weapons and tactics, or SWAT teams. A primary objective of this massive display of military might is to terrorize the people into conforming to the virtues and ideas that sustain a race-structured militaristic society. These virtues uphold white supremacy by use of the idea that the value of African Americans and other people of color to the United States is to provide cheap labor for the economy and cannon fodder for the military. So that conformity by people of color to these genocidal virtues and ideas means internalizing a collective self-image of powerlessness and of being unworthy of justice. Now, I will close my remarks by saying that rejecting this derogatory self-image is no easy task. When specific groups have been designated by the government to function at the lowest rungs of the economy, the law expects them to conform to their place in society. This was the purpose of the Plessy decision of 1896 that legitimized Jim Crow segregation. These laws empower whites to interact with people of color in ways that reinforce racial subordination. A good example of this occurred in Cincinnati, Ohio, the very same year as the Plessy ruling. In a book titled Dr. Charles Lewis Metz and the American Indian Archaeology of the Little Miami River Valley, authors Kenneth Burnett Tankersley and Robert Brand Newman provide a classical example of how whites in Cincinnati, Ohio, expected Native Americans to internalize their inferiority and conform to their genocidal mistreatment. In late June of 1896, the manager of the Cincinnati Zoological Society had been inspired by a previous project that made profits from displaying Native Americans as, quote, wild people among, quote, wild animals. he arranged for 89 Lakota from the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations to perform historical reenactments of the Battle of Little Bighorn and the massacre at Wounded Knee. And they were to perform these at 3 o'clock p.m. and again at 8:30 p.m. in the zoo's arena. With the Ohio National Guard playing the role of the 7th Cavalry, the expectation of whites was that the Native Americans reenact their genocidal mistreatment by the U.S. military as entertainment for white audiences twice a day as their service to humanity. Wittingly or unwittingly, they were exhibiting the true meaning of the adages, kill the Indian and save the man, and the only good Indian is a dead Indian. The massacre at Wounded Knee, which occurred 6 years earlier on December 29, 1890, had marked the end of 4 centuries of armed conflict between the Native Americans and whites. After Wounded Knee, Native Americans were intended to exist as defeated, dead cultures. By World War II, it was assumed by government officials that the languages of indigenous people were sufficiently dead to the rest of the world that it would be safe to employ Indians as code talkers and use their languages as a means of secret communication. The Navajo were by no means the only language used. Code talking was pioneered by the Cherokee and Choctaw during World War I, and by World War II, the Lakota, the Meskwaki, the Mohawk, Comanche, Tlingit, Hopi, Cree, and Crow were deployed in various theaters throughout the war. With languages intended to remain unknown to the world, their value to the United States is to function as the living dead. During the Vietnam conflict, they died disproportionately on the front lines and as tunnel rats doing their service for America. They had been recruited from impoverished lifestyles on the reservation, which made them vulnerable to military propaganda. African Americans and other people of color are facing the same impoverished conditions. Whether it be a reservation, a ghetto, or barrio, people of color are forced to reside in these militarized occupation zones or warehouses of cannon fodder for the United States military. Because of the necessity of the government to control and contain these areas, the residents are disproportionately represented in the state and federal penitentiaries and routinely terrorized by the police. This means that the unarmed men and women, children, occupants can expect to be targeted by law enforcement and sacrificed in the interest of preserving a racist and militaristic society. It is therefore important for African Americans and other people of color to resist internalizing the militaristic virtues and ideas that threaten their daily existence. They must engage in community-based empowerment initiatives that will heighten consciousness about the adverse effects of militarism, that will honor the legacies and sustain the pursuit of justice for those who have lost their lives by militaristic means. Our program today is an attempt to raise consciousness, honor legacies, and sustain the pursuit of justice for unarmed blacks whose memories must be sustained. Our panel will address the specific cases involving Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., Breonna Taylor, and Oscar Grant. Now, here to introduce our distinguished panelists and moderate the discussion is veteran community organizer, human rights activist, and author of Close Encounters of the Dangerous Kind, Daniel Buford.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. It's really an honor to be able to participate in this program as well as to share this information from the research that you cited earlier. And some of the cases from that research are actually going to be heard from, as you just mentioned. One of those cases from the research has to do with the murder of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. at the hands of White Plains police when they invaded his home when his medical alert went off, and they refused to take no for an answer when he told them that there was no problem. So you'll hear what resulted from that. You also hear from Reverend McClendon, who's coming to us from Louisville, Kentucky, who will talk about the Breonna Taylor case from the standpoint of human rights violations and different ways of framing what that issue really is about. And Reverend McClinton has done some research on the research that I have done, linking the Breonna Taylor case with other cases that are similar in nature in terms of how the police busted in and what kind of things ensued after they broke into people's homes on no-knock warrants. Hopefully, Captain Reverend, I call him Reverend, that's a Freudian slip because he's also a teacher of the Bible and a theologian, but Reginald Lyles, hopefully he will be able to be here because he has some personal involvement in justice in the Oscar Grant case in Oakland, California, a few years back. So we have those lined up, and so we have as our first guest Miss Sandra Burnaby, and I was already doing this research and on these cases, and I was in correspondence with Sandra Burnaby, and somehow we got to talking about a case that was something that I'd studied that she had some awareness of. And so one thing led to another, and you will hear that now in the report that Sandra Burnaby gives, which will be followed by a videotape statement of Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. So, Sandra, welcome.
Thank you so much for including me in this important panel. Getting involved with the work of the Kenneth Chamberlain case has changed my life and has organized so many of us in my community. But you know, Daniel, you're best known in the New York metro area, not only as being a trainer for the Undoing Racism workshop and your Undoing Racism work, but also being a human rights educator and bringing anti-racism and human rights together. And we lift you in the work that you did to bring the human rights violations of Katrina to The Hague. And you'll always be remembered for that and thanked.
Thank you.
Yeah. But, you know, the story starts on 10 years ago, this coming Friday. I was driving in my car and I hear on the radio that a man had been killed in a public housing building in White Plains. Like a 90-minute battle ensued. The police had to break down the door, and unfortunately this man was killed. Turns out that he was a 60-year-old retired veteran. He was a corrections officer. And just by the building that he lived in, I knew that another Black man had been killed. Right after that report, they interviewed his son, Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., who said, listen, I don't hate police. I just need to find out what happened. And so we started, the whole community, I mean, it was just so compelling that it was happening right in our community that we started following Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. And this man was everywhere. He said that on the gurney, he promised his father that he would get justice. And with lightning speed, he was on the radio, he was in the news, had church gatherings, community gatherings, forums, crying out for justice for his father. And over time, we found out what happened because we learned that a medical alert had been triggered and it was recording the entire time that Mr. Chamberlain had interactions with the police. And so all that I'll share with you now has been documented. We learned that the father was accidentally triggered his medical alert very early in the morning, like 5:30. And when he did not respond to the person's asking, Mr. Chamberlain, are you okay? Are you okay? They called the police for a wellness check. And so Mr. Chamberlain woke up to police banging on his door and banging and banging and banging. Wake up, Mr. Chamberlain. And he looked out of the peephole and he saw White Plains police. And he said, okay, leave me alone. It was an accident. No, Mr. Chamberlain, open up the door. No, he says, I'm not going to open up the door. I understand that you came to help. There's no need for you. Please go away. And they engaged in a power struggle where the police said, you will open up this door. And Mr. Chamberlain said, I will not open up this door. Mr. Chamberlain suffered from PTSD, and he started to trigger, and he started to panic. And the more he said, leave me be, the more aggressive they became, and the angrier they became, and the more pissed off they came. They became more and more aggressive. They called him names. They provoked him. They called him the N-word. They were banging and banging on the doors. They called in more police. They had shields, tactical gears. They had guns. You know, at one point, people from the building were coming up the steps saying, please, we know Mr. Chamberlain, let us speak to him. No, you have to leave. The police said, this is our area, get away. They begged him, please, you're making this worse. No, all of these people were pushed away. So on the recording, you can hear Mr. Chamberlain saying, officers, why do you have your guns drawn? I've done nothing. Please put them away. And the last thing we hear him say is, my name is Kenneth Chamberlain, Sr. This is my last will and testimony. The White Plains police are knocking down my door and they're coming to kill me. And that's exactly what happened. They tore down his door. They tasered him. And Officer Anthony Corelli executed the final shot that killed him, standing there in his boxer shorts and his oxygen tank. Killed him. His son, Kenneth, said, I will find justice. I will not end until we find justice. Within 20 days, Kenneth Chamberlain rallied up a group of people, and we started the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. And many of the people look like me, white people who are outraged, who couldn't believe what we were hearing, because we could hear through, over time, we heard recordings. And he rallied a legal team that was amazing, a legal team, a press team, media coverage, his friends, everywhere he went. Kenneth Chamberlain with this legal team and the press team and his friends, these 6 men and women would walk into a room. And what I say is that it wasn't Kenneth Chamberlain. It was a concept that walked into the room. They went to court. We filled the courts. People were outside protesting. The concept that was in the room was the concept of Black dignity, Black power, Black resolve. And year after year, case after case, Officer Corelli is absolved of wrongdoing because of qualified immunity, a law that shields and protects officers from liability of civil lawsuits. And they've had numerous appeals. And right now, there's another one pending. And so it was undoing racism that brought me to this work, because after this happened, I mean, I know that Daniel Buford, and friends with Daniel Buford, the work that he was doing with arbitrary punishment. And he'll be talking about the codification of summary executions. But the language of human rights is so powerful that we invited Daniel to fly out from California to New York. And in March of 2016, he spent a week here, going from place to place, educating people about the need for us to understand that police killings is also a human rights violation. And at the Westpac meeting, he met with Kenneth Chamberlain. And after Daniel delivered his human rights analysis and educated us about language that we should be using, language like summary executions, extrajudicial executions, torture, unarmed men and women of African descent having these dangerous police encounters. Kenneth took on and integrated that language into the sharing of information about what had happened to his father. So we've come to understand that even though police killings are immoral, they're happening right in front of our eyes in videos. And we understand that this is wrong, that executions are happening. the most outrageous thing that we've come to understand is that it isn't necessarily illegal for police to kill Black people, and they will get away with it. And so Kenneth Chamberlain has said that after 10 years, justice looks different. We may never get this police officer who killed his father. But what we must do, he said, is to create civilian complaint boards that have subpoena power, that we have to have mental health respondents. So his father didn't need to look out of the peephole and to see a gun. He should have saw a social worker or a healthcare provider. Hold police officers accountable by doing away with these laws like qualified immunity that shield police officers, and put prosecutors in place that are not afraid to prosecute. He's created a video for us that we can take a look at now, but you need to know that he continues to organize, and Kenneth Chamberlain actually had a featured film made about the killing of his father. And it's produced in 2019. It's starring Frankie Faison, promoted by Morgan Freeman. And we hope that you'll just hold it up with the rest of the documentation that has happened, you know, the Bart killings and the others. But I just want to now just turn it over to Daniel and to ask if you can run Kenneth Chamberlain's video.
Thank you, and thank you for that statement. And I believe we have the video available to be seen now. Thank you for your statement and your work.
Yes.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. I am one of the co-founders of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. This coalition was founded in 2012 after the killing of my father, Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., at the hands of White Plains Police Department. So, bigger than being the co-founder of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, I am also a family member that is impacted by police violence. But before I begin to have a conversation with you guys, I want to acknowledge Daniel Buford, who I met in March of 2016. You know, when you are fighting these types of fights, families like mine, we're lost. We really don't know what direction to turn to, where to go, what to say, what type of language to use. And you have these governments that basically read from the same playbook. But Daniel helped me understand a little bit about language when I am addressing the issue around families that are impacted by police violence. So I now use the term extrajudicial killing and summary execution because my father was a victim of a summary execution at the hands of White Plains Police Department. On the day that he was killed, for those of you who don't know, he inadvertently triggered his life aid pendant that he wore around his neck. He suffered from a heart condition, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as well as bipolar disorder. When he activated his pendant around his neck, the monitoring station did not get a response. They then contacted White Plains Police Department, who are first responders, and they arrived at my father's home at a housing project in White Plains, 135 South Lexington. They knocked on the door. My dad said he was okay. He didn't call them, but that wasn't enough for these police officers. For 90 minutes, they began to bang on his door, demanding that he open the door. And he was within his right not to, because we know that there are 3 circumstances in which police can make entry into your home. And that is with permission, with a warrant, or through exigent circumstances. And they didn't have any of those 3. So they eventually took the door off his hinges, fired an electronic taser at him, a beanbag shotgun, and then live rounds shooting and killing him, alleging that he posed an imminent threat to life or well-being. Of course, the Westchester County District Attorney at that time promised a full and fair investigation, but in May of 2012 came back with no true bill. even justifying the use of an N-word that was hurled at my father before he was killed. So this began this movement in White Plains or in Westchester County, or really this birth of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. And our focus is about greater police accountability and transparency, because the name of the game is accountability. Now, since that time, many different things have happened, and one in particular as of late is that there is a film called The Killing of Kenneth Chamberlain. This film is a fictional narrative based on the true events that led to my father's death. I apologize in advance for any trauma this film may cause. It is a hard watch, but it is a necessary watch. And my hope is that this film is going to force real dialogue, real conversations around policing and how we can change it. An example would be civilian complaint review boards, with subpoena power though, because they're useless without them. Putting mental health services in emergency responses, because I always say if a person is experiencing a mental health crisis, they don't want to see someone with a badge and a gun. They want to see someone who is a clinician, a mental health professional, someone who understands that their job is to diffuse a situation, not create one. We want to look at educating the community, not just on what to do if you're stopped by law enforcement, but how do you survive a law enforcement encounter? And of course, when we're talking about mental health as well, not just the mental health of individuals they encounter in the street, but the mental health of the police officer as well. Why? Because police officers only do one psych test, and that is at the beginning of the process when they are being vetted to be hired. And all of that is great. But if you do not have laws in place or remove laws that protect police officers, like qualified immunity, or actually put laws in place that are going to hold them accountable, it means absolutely nothing. You have to have prosecutors, though, who are not afraid to prosecute these officers when they commit these egregious acts. So, unfortunately, I couldn't join you guys, so I decided to do this video because I'm very, very busy promoting the film that's going to be exclusively on HBO Max on November 19th. But I just wanted to come on and just say to you guys, I appreciate you all. My family and I appreciate you. Thank you for standing in solidarity with us, because without you guys, we couldn't stand as strong as we're standing. And I just want to say, may there be accountability for Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., and may there be accountability for all families that are impacted by police violence. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Sandra, for bringing this to our attention and making sure that this video, this very important video, got to us, and so people can hear what Kenneth has to say in his own words. And given the historical overlay that Dr. Washington gave us on racism and militarism, we can see here how there was an ideology that these police were operating on. Before we switch gears into the next topic and the next speaker, could you talk about the training that these police officers received just prior to this incident happening?
You know, I was not able to confirm that, but what was told, or what we believe, is that the level of aggression that they showed up with and their insistence that nobody interrupt, that there was some danger going on, and the fact that they showed up with tactical gear, you know, I'm still trying to confirm that, Daniel. It was said that they had received some kind of training on how to intervene, you know, with the terrorists, basically. But I have to just say, in all honesty, I have not confirmed that. That's right. What was said.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And, even whether you find out anything or not, I know for a fact that they did. And as have all the different police jurisdictions around the country have received this type of military tactical training, the same that the Army Special Forces and the Marines have used in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Panama, and many other places where the United States has invaded a place militarily. So here is a man, Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., who was a veteran and had actually worked in the penal justice system and was a retiree from that, had served this country well. And now here he is being invaded as if he is in an occupied territory, which he is and was. So then when we talk about racism and militarism is applied racism. It is the martial enforcement of genocidal policies. It's not enough that there is an ideology which talks about racism and white supremacy, or that there is a doctrine or methodologies of ensuring that. The way that it is concretized and the way it is applied is through militaristic means, and that is through the police and the military. And so then no-knock warrants are applied in a militaristic way in the black community, and this is indiscriminate in the black community with respect to gender. And what they do to men, they do to women. And so, Reverend McClendon, could you speak to us about the research and study that you've done, just looking at this idea of these attacks and the Breonna Taylor case, and what similarities perhaps the Breonna Taylor case, which people see as an individual case, might have with cases in the past from the research you studied?
Sure. First, I'd just like to echo Dr. Washington's comments during his introduction about the great work on compiling these 30 cases of unarmed African-American women who were assaulted in violent ways by police officers. Reverend Buford has done some outstanding work, and I studied those 30 cases and learned a great deal. Many of them were very, very disturbing. So what I'd like to do before I get into the patterns and similarities to the Breonna Taylor case is just sort of provide a little bit of a summary on the 30 victims of those cases. 3 of those 30 victims were age 50 and over. And one of those was a 92-year-old woman who police broke in her door, shot her multiple times, and she was a victim of summary execution. I don't have enough time to provide all the details, but the fact alone that she was a 92-year-old woman who was brutalized and killed multiple times, and hers was, the police had attacked her and they had the wrong address. So this gives you a flavor for some of the atrocities associated with the various killings of these victims. 5 victims were age 18 and under. I believe the youngest was 7 years old. 2 of the victims were pregnant women. 7 experienced prior physical or mental conditions. 2 were involved with traffic stops. 2 or 3 were victims of police being at the wrong address. 2 were victims of police planting false narcotics in their homes to cover up the fact that they had attacked the wrong address. In another category of violent encounters, 6 women were victims of multiple gunshots. 2 were victims of gunshots to the head, neck, and temple. 3 were victims of chest compression, choking, or suffocation. And 1 was the victim of a taser, electroshock, or stun gun. Now remember, these are unarmed African American women. We often hear about these kinds of things happening to unarmed African American males, but we don't hear very much at all about what is happening to African American women and girls who are often treated even worse than African American males. So there was another female who was the victim of beating and physical assault, another that was a victim of genital and sexual assault, another that was a victim of death or injury in custody, in a police car, or in a holding cell. 1 was a victim of death while surrendering. There were 3 women who were victims of vehicular homicide and 3 who were victims of denial or delay of medical treatment. And I went through that because it gives you a flavor for how they were victimized. And I wanted to do that before talking about Breonna Taylor. Finally, I'd like to say, out of these 30 cases, the majority of these women suffered death in the form of summary executions, extrajudicial punishment, arbitrary detention, punishments, and execution, and torture. All of those threads ran through these 30 cases. And if you have the time, I would encourage anyone who is interested in knowing a little bit more of the detail associated with those 30 cases to get Reverend Buford's research and compilations to actually see the details of what happened. So I have compiled the patterns and similarities to the Breonna Taylor case, and I'd like to share those now. First, relative to these 30 cases of unarmed women who experienced violent police assaults and unlawful deaths, Breonna Taylor was an unarmed woman and victim of summary execution. And just so that I don't want to assume anything, but a summary execution is an execution that happens immediately without any due process of law or legal proceedings, and before any legal proceeding can take place. The policeman acts as judge, jury, and executioner without a full and fair trial. So the process, the legal process that any human being is entitled to is circumvented by rogue police officers. Secondly, of the 30 cases, chaotic and violent police behaviors in many of those cases created disturbances that violated human rights and ended in unlawful deaths, including summary executions. In the context of Breonna Taylor's case, and according to a July 23rd, 2020 CNN article. The police operation in the early morning hours of March 13 was tragically flawed. And the scene that night was described as chaotic. And there is substantial video footage confirming the chaos and rogue behavior and attitudes of police officers that night. And one of the things that many people do not realize is that the 3 police officers who broke into her home that night were really criticized for not following procedures, not following things that they had learned as part of their training. They did not appear to be very experienced officers. One of them was the lead officer, who seemed to be the more rational of the 3. 2 of those 3 officers were either dismissed or terminated eventually after her unlawful killing. And the video footage is a bit disturbing to watch. If you have not seen that, if you're interested, I would encourage you to look at that. Relative to militarism, in these 30 cases, there was at least one of those cases where a no-knock warrant based on false information resulted in attacks made at a wrong address with innocent victims killed with multiple shots. And this is in the instance of the 92-year-old unarmed woman that I referenced earlier, who was killed with 5 gunshots. In the Breonna Taylor case, a no-knock warrant was served around midnight, and that was intentional. The police made this decision later not to the decision to knock at Miss Taylor's door, as they decided that they did not consider her to be dangerous. And the police officers made numerous mistakes, ultimately ending up ramming in her door. And they did not calculate that Miss Taylor would not be at home alone. She was with her boyfriend, who was legally armed. And they had also decided, the police officers that is, to press forward with a high-risk forced entry once because there was no response. And Mr. Kenneth Walker, Miss Taylor's boyfriend, never heard the police. He didn't know who was at the door, but he knew someone was knocking, but he never heard the police say they were police officers. So the officers used a battering ram to break down Miss Taylor's door, and there is no body camera video of what transpired in the moments after officers bashed through Miss Taylor's door. Nothing, which is really pretty interesting. In the 30 cases, there were a number of those involving multiple shots and death by summary execution. It was dark in Breonna Taylor's apartment, and she was shot multiple times after her boyfriend shot the lead officer in his leg out of self-defense, not knowing that these men were police officers. And the chaotic scene there in her apartment was also exacerbated by one of the 3 officers who was accused by his own department of blindly firing 10 rounds into Breonna Taylor's apartment from an outdoor patio. I don't know if this was before they broke into her apartment or afterwards, but the shots were also fired by one of the officers into a neighboring apartment where a child lived. So there were all kinds of acts of irresponsibility. In the 30 cases, 3 women were victims of denied or delayed medical treatment. Breonna Taylor lay in the floor, bleeding heavily as a result of multiple shots, which occurred after the lead officer was shot by her boyfriend out of self-defense. She received no medical attention as the police left the apartment to tend to the wounded lead police officer. They didn't ask. They never inquired as to if anyone was hurt. They never asked any questions. They just left. The search warrant was for drugs, but no drugs were found. Police officers suspected that Miss Taylor was tied to her old boyfriend's drug ring, but she was not. In the 30 cases, rogue police behaviors were a common thread. Disrespectful language, detention, and militaristic treatment of unarmed women. In the Breonna Taylor case, police were very disrespectful to Kenneth Walker, her boyfriend, when they ordered him to come out of the apartment. They used military tactics, yelling loudly at him as he was sternly ordered to walk backwards down the stairs from Miss Taylor's second floor apartment toward them with his hands in the air. If you can just imagine that, walking backward downstairs with your hands up requires quite a bit of balance. Mr. Walker repeatedly asked, what is this all about? Explaining that he and Miss Taylor were asleep in bed while watching a movie. At one point, the police officers yelled at Mr. Walker that he would turn the dogs loose on him if he didn't cooperate, even though Mr. Walker was cooperating fully and was visibly frightened on the video footage. And I can only imagine that he was thinking about all the African-American males that were murdered unjustly at the hands of police officers, and he could see himself heading in that direction. Mr. Walker was taken away in handcuffs. 6 days later, a grand jury indicted him of attempted murder of a police officer. The indictment was returned following a brief presentation in which members of the panel were essentially told only that Walker had opened fire on the police during a raid and that one of the officers had been hit. That's all they were told. Grand jurors were not told that Mr. Walker said he was unaware the people who broke through Taylor's door were police, and he believed he was acting in self-defense. Nor was the panel told of Miss Taylor's death. So that was the withholding of key evidence. And this pertains to more of the rogue behaviors of the police. There was a gentleman by the name of Walter Katz, who was a veteran police oversight expert who has monitored departments in Los Angeles, San Jose, and Chicago. And he called the known circumstances surrounding Breonna Taylor's death very problematic and indicative of systemic flaws in training and tactics. Many policemen escape a prosecution by saying that they feared for their lives. That happened in one of those 30 cases. And I just want to say that when I read that, I wrote a note very similar to a quote I'm going to provide from Reverend Buford's compilation, because I think my reaction was the same as his. And his quote says, "This, when a police officer responds to a wrongful act, rogue behavior, where someone has been wrongfully killed, that they feared for their lives." Reverend Buford says, "This is the same incredible lie that is told by policemen who have shot all the other unarmed men, women, and children of African descent. This police defense is a free pass for murder and state-sponsored terrorism." And as I close, I just want to say that the question crossed my mind: why do we have so many, the rising numbers of cases involving violent police assaults against African American women, men, and children? Why do we have this? And I think that quote from Reverend Buford points out a big part of the problem. So the solution lies within the reasons that these cases are on the rise. When you have what Reverend Buford describes as state-sponsored terrorism, which is basically the endorsement or refusal to challenge wrongful deaths, these situations will continue to occur. So I just want to say in conclusion that reviewing the 30 cases of violent police assaults, this familiar proverb came to mind, and it is, "There but the grace of God go I." I realized as I read all those terrible things that happened to those 30 women that this proverb is a recognition that the misfortune of others could be one's own. And if it weren't for the blessing of God's grace, that could happen to any African American women. And so I found myself visualizing these horrific injustices, which were very unsettling to me. They were all cases reflecting the widespread racism and hatred of African Americans and violent police officers whose rogue behavior, acting as judge, jury, and executioners in these violent encounters, resulted in unjustifiable executions of innocent people without consequences. Racially motivated, state-sponsored terrorism continues to spike in the United States, and it's a serious problem that continues to go unaddressed. I would really encourage anyone whose curiosity has been spiked by the work that Reverend Buford has done on these 30 cases, get a copy of his work and read it for some very eye-opening and shocking information. And finally, I'd like to extend kudos to Reverend Buford for his unfailing passion and continuing work to advance social justice. And I'd like to extend thanks to Dr. Washington for his commitment to leverage his knowledge to teach others about the vast body of knowledge that encompasses social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend McClinton. That was very, very thoughtful and very heartfelt in what you were saying there. Both yourself and Sandra made references to some things within that research. And that research is available, actually it has been published back in 2016 in
Yes.
Tikkun magazine in the article that is called Close Encounters of a Dangerous Kind. And the subtitle of it has to do with the deaths of unarmed African Americans at the hands of police. And in that work, actually, I do those 30 cases that you cited, but it also is connected to all the other cases that I worked on.
Yes.
More than those women, there's even more than
Yes.
those 30 cases, as well as the men and the boys. And all of the things come down to that none of these were individual and unique events. Actually, they were each a kind of event. Like, for instance, when we look at the death of George Floyd, who Derek Chauvin was accused of killing him, rightly so, by kneeling on his neck, and the death being determined to be chest compression asphyxia.
Yeah.
But he's not the first person that cops have done that to. Kayla Moore, an African American transgender woman, died that way when cops responded to what was supposed to be a medical emergency. They over-responded by arresting Kayla's attendant, who had some jive traffic tickets, and then left Kayla exposed to these cops who came in and basically smothered Kayla to death. And this is one of the methods of death that they use often for black women who are in mental institutions. In my research, I found several instances of that, which to me, it means that several things. This is one of the ways that cops kill people without leaving any marks on you. There's another way that they kill you that leaves marks on you, but they don't have to put their hands on you when they take you on the rough ride or the nickel ride, as they killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and a number of people have died by the fact that they're left in the back of a police vehicle, usually a van, and they're thrown in there on the floor with their hands cuffed in back of them. And then the driver or the drivers of the van take them on a rough ride, driving them on the most rough roads that they can, stopping and starting quickly, making sharp turns. And all of this serves to buffet the person back in the van against the sides of the van. So you get the van to beat the person to death, and they come up with a broken neck or broken limbs or whatever, and a cop hasn't even touched them. I found other instances of how people were done that way. So, there's a lot to be said, but I'll just say with respect to the current efforts to defund the police, believe it or not, I actually don't support that. I think that they should be demilitarized, and because I want the cops to be well paid and have their benefits and have everything else that everybody has, so you can't defund them if they're going to be having that kind of stuff. But I want them to show up if there's a burglary in my community, but not blame the victims, when they show up. So defunding the cops isn't the answer, but demilitarize them. They don't need Army stuff that was used in Iraq or Afghanistan, in Cincinnati or any other municipality within the United States, nor do they need to be using these Gestapo military tactics. Here's an interesting thing, because Dr. Washington is your student. Okay. Well, we've got a word from a student that's going to come by in a moment, who's going to break down her analysis. But I'll just say that to conclude what I'm talking about, that our communities are treated as occupied military territories, whether we see them that way or not. And the proof of that is that they don't even have to get confirmation of the correct address before they come in and kill a 92-year-old, a 7-year-old, or a 57-year-old African-American female. Dr. Washington, could you introduce the student who has been so patient and see what?
Absolutely, we have a wonderful student, Amari Johnson, whose background she's a first year student, but her background is history with a really strong interest in African American history, and she is serving as a responder to today's presentation. So, if Amari would like to say something about what you've heard so far, we would really love to hear you, Amari.
I've been reading the documents that I was sent just to get a background, and then listening to what I've heard as well. And Reverend Mary, I believe, said something that was interesting, and she was just asking, why is this happening to our people? And in the document that I was reading from Reverend Buford, Dr. Washington, it talked about like the background of police officers, and I truly believe the background that they come from influences how we get treated. It wasn't to protect and serve at first, it was to trap and abuse slaves that were running off. And I truly believe that is one of the reasons why this militaristic and abusive nature comes from police officers in terms of Black people. And it's a sad case. It definitely is. And then I also think that is why people are saying defund the police, though that might not be the most realistic, and it may not be the best option to go right now. I truly believe that is one of the reasons why they say that, because why allow the police officers to still be in this training that comes from the abuse, the misuse, and the overall mistreatment of people that came from this descendant of them being slave catchers, if that makes sense. And that was what I had for right now. That's just what's been on my mind since I've been listening to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Thank you.
of course.
Go ahead. Were you going to ask her something? Okay, well, I think you got amen on that. I just wanted to say that it's important that you, I don't know how old or young you are, but it's important for you to participate in this conversation, particularly being here at Northern Kentucky University. And I got to be an organizer here and point out that the Reverend McClendon is here in Kentucky also. And that you are apparently of like mind on this topic about Black women being invaded by police. And so I would ask the two of you to take the next step and do some networking around just knowing each other. But also think about this. Should there be a response of Black women's groups, church groups, when a Black woman is killed by the cops? There should be a response from everybody, sure, for males, but I'm saying, shouldn't there be some kind of special response when cops are going in and saying these things about our women, and whether they're in their 90s or they're 7 years old? I just think that deserves some above and beyond the call of duty type of response. I'm not too confident right now of the so-called leadership of the Black Lives Matters movement, because they seem to be leading people into an ideological trap by calling for violence or predicting violence in the head of protests or in the head of anything. I don't believe in that. And I believe that since my experience of seeing them grow up like a mushroom in off of the work that we did in Oakland, that group as an organization is very opportunistic. They don't really have roots or sink roots in the community. And every time a Black person gets killed, they make a lot of money off of the publicity, but no money resides with those families of the people that have a loved one killed. So until they are able to parlay their millions of dollars in real estate into some money and grants for each of the families that had have somebody die at the hands of the cops since Black Lives Matters came into existence in 2012, I don't believe that anybody can claim their real legitimacy as a group. other than a bunch of people who are exploiting the misery of people of African descent. Even as I say that, the idea of Black Lives Mattering is not new to that group, and is certainly an idea whose time has come. And people from Phyllis Wheatley to Frederick Douglass to Sonia Sanchez and Nika Giovanni and Alice Walker and Langston Hughes and everybody, we've been saying that all along. Dr. King was saying that. Malcolm X was saying that. So if people are just now getting a memo that our lives matter, here's a news alert. We've known that all along, even when everybody was considering us 3/5 of a human being, which is the way that the law treats us now.
Well, qualified immunity is a doctrine that protects state and local officials, including law enforcement officers, from individual liability unless the official violated a clearly established constitutional right. And so, on its inception, it had some merit because they wanted to protect local and state officials from what they call nuisance civil complaints, and so it was established, but it has hence run amok as it relates to law enforcement officers. In law enforcement, it has eroded to the point where the most grossed officers will get prosecuted or fired from their jobs. But the officers that do almost the same egregious acts against the public are fiercely protected, and qualified immunity absolves them from any accountability to some of their actions. Consequently, what has happened is that law enforcement protects the worst officers within their ranks, as opposed to removing them and holding on to a noble standard of serving the public. The group in the public that has received the most, I don't even think this is debatable, offense from law enforcement has been the African American population and other people of color. So we have these gross shootings and killings, and of which people complained about over and over and over, but where the system said, we don't believe you, can you prove it? Now that we've gotten body cameras on police officers, it's been exposed of the gross neglect that some police officers do to African Americans. And qualified immunity ends up protecting those most egregious officers. Now, if we take the most recent case where the officer, Chaupin, had his knee on the gentleman's back and neck, and while he was begging for his mother, you could see that the officer was just calm and he was comfortable. You got to understand that this was a guy who had been in 3 other police officer involved shootings and killings, and he had been promoted and lauded for his actions. He was, instead of him being off the force, he was the lead officer there. He was the field training officer. So you have the very worst type of folk turning a noble profession in law enforcement into its worst example of protecting the public. I've heard it said that the police are moving in a direction where they don't serve the public serves them, and that's a dangerous situation for our democracy, and it's a dangerous situation for African Americans in general. So I'm for removing qualified immunity until we get this situation back in balance, where you have local police and state officers abiding by the Constitution and being held accountable for the egregious acts that they do.
So these series that we have done, as we wrap this one up, is the fourth one, and each of them actually covers ideas in a book that I've just written called the Prayer Warrior's Reflections. And these Prayer Warrior's Reflections, I am the prayer warrior, and they are my reflections of 50 years of activism, social change, and community organizing. So the ideas that we have talked about in the series on human rights that deal with white supremacy laws and white privilege laws, that dealt with education as a human right, that has dealt with linguistic racism and the language of politics, and now today dealing with racism, militarism, and the death of unarmed African Americans. All of these ideas are ideas that are covered in the book that hopefully will be out in the next year. But we've been in a way test marketing the ideas, and we know that with this particular one that there would always be another case. And as I conclude, I just want to lift up the name of Ahmaud Arbery and the fact that Reverend Al Sharpton, as a minister, sat with this family as other ministers have. And this is the work that has followed me over my career, from the death of Wadey Suttles in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1983, when I worked with his daughter, Maxine Cousins, may she rest in peace, to the work that I did out in Oakland with the Oscar Grant family after Oscar Grant was murdered, or the work that I did in Berkeley with Maria Moore after Kayla Moore was smothered to death, or the work that I've done with the Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. movement to find police accountable and equity. All of these things are examples of how a minister, black ministers in particular, must stand with the people and must stand with us as a people, particularly when somebody has been killed like this, because ain't nobody else going to stand with them. So when that guy was saying, well, we don't want to have too many more of these black pastors coming down here, by God, and filling up our courtroom like this Al Sharpton and who was that in that last week? That was Jesse Jackson. Well, we don't want one of them. Well, when that dude was saying that, what he was really wanting to say. So I think that the black ministers who are in that region ought to take that as a challenge and show up in numbers in that courtroom, so that there's standing room only there. Because that's an outrageous, that they ought to be able to have anybody sit with them that they need to. The book of Ezekiel says, and then I came to them of the captivity at Tel Aviv by the river of Chebar, and I sat where they sat, and I was astonished. That's what we must do, be willing to sit where the people sit, be astonished, and then deliver the word of the Lord. God bless you, and thank you for listening to this.
Folks, this has been a magnificent panel. The whole series have been really magnificent, I would argue. But this concludes our program. Now, we'll have a lot more Afrocentricity programs coming with different topics, but this concludes our particular seminar on the concept of human rights as it relates to these various issues. So until next time, this is Afrocentricity. I'm Michael Washington. See you then.